Hello. All right. Thank you for coming. And I'm taking a look here and seeing what you've covered. So the third, we covered mestizaje. And see here, the 10th, the English colonies. And then the 17th, I must have written it on a different spot. Shoot. Anyway, um, so let me take a look. Sorry, at your syllabus. So by now, right, you guys have already done the War for Independence and you're on the A Tale of Two Early Republics. Is that correct? You guys there? All right. I'm going to go ahead and get your names down, and then I'm going to jump into the those two because recall you could be, even if you're a little late and turning something in, I still want you to do it. I don't dock that many points for late work. So be sure that you turn everything in, even if some of it is late. Right. So on this, right, what I do is I take a sympathetic uh, stance toward Mexico and Latin America. All right. So if you notice, it's a little bit redundant between these two. So on the independence, right? What I contend is basically what I contend in the next one, and I just go a little further with the argument. And that is that the ideological gap between the left and the right, right? In the Giron, when the Giron was running the French Revolution, those who wanted radical change sat on the left wing of the Estates Chamber, and those who wanted like the old tradition and to keep things as traditional as possible sat on the right wing, and that still serves as an indicator today between left and right. So at any rate, those on the left, right, were arguably led by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson wrote very ill of slavery, right? He wrote very ill of aristocratic government and said that government should be more participatory and more democratic. He also, when he was governor of Virginia, tried to give um, parcels of land to the poor people of Virginia. All right. So that sounds kind of radical, right? And then he had read his Adam Smith, and he, of course, was against the mercantilist system with its monopolies and patronage, having to have the right people approve of you to do something for a living. He wanted a much more open and free market. Absolutely. He was so afraid of tyrannical government that he went back to the Angles and Saxons and wanted villages and village councils and courts of 100, just generically called hundreds. Okay. So that seems like he's kind of, pretty far to the left. However, when you look deeper and you scratch the surface, you find, I'm not so sure. All right. So, first of all, when it came to slavery, uh, he did not want his notes on the state of Virginia to be published. He never did. They were meant to be private correspondence with a friend. And and he also believed that, excuse me, now I'm getting the hiccups, that the slavery hurts the republic and even hurts the master. It gives the master a false sense of despotic power and inerrancy, as if he's perfect and he could do what he wants. Um, it makes a sycophant of the slaves. The slaves can't ever be honest. They have to kind of kiss up to their master, and you can never really trust them. So he had like logical reasons why slavery was an impractical institution. But when it came to the African Americans, right? He's the one that said, we have the wolf by the ears and we dare not let it go. There had been so many injustices to the African Americans that he did not trust that they would not foment some type of a revolution once they had the chance to get even with their white masters and people. All right. He also believed in the innate inferiority of Black people. He thought they were naturally less intelligent, less capable of creating culture, less capable of participating in government, etc. Then when he said he wanted more democracy, he did not want a democracy, all right? He wanted a republic like we have. He wanted some offices to be elected, others to be handpicked, men of leisure who have done their reading and have a fine education and have some wealth and don't need to be paid by the government and can make more wise decisions, okay? And so, matter of fact, he just said that when the people, the power that they have, he admitted to John Adams that it will be until there is a national public school system, like a kid without driver's training behind a wheel. And remember, that's what Aristotle and Plato had said about democracy, about the common person, that the common person lacked the ethical self-control and the intelligence and sagacity and the learning to rule well. And so Thomas Jefferson did kind of agree with that. And he did not want a democracy. He wanted the republic as it was, with checks and balances. All right. And then land. He only wanted to give that land out to the poor whites. And he was afraid that there might be another Bacon's Rebellion, another like real serious poor man's rebellion against the rich establishment of the Tidewater region of Virginia. So his motives weren't very upright to begin with in giving that land out. And he was offering the land of Native Americans to them. So notice, right, when they met at the Constitutional Convention, this liberal Thomas Jefferson, he didn't agree to have Monticello, his estate, broken up into little parcels for poor people. He was not willing to share. All right. So he did not have a stomach for land redistribution. And then speaking of the Native Americans, he thought they were inferior, but one step above African Americans in that they were inferior by circumstance. And they just needed to become educated and civilized. And they stood a chance in the future to be American citizens, but not now. All right. And then as far as his capitalist side, he acted like he wanted just a completely free market. And the first president, his Secretary of Treasury, right, Washington's, was Alexander Hamilton. And Hamilton heavily intervened in the economy. As you might know, he created a national bank. He took bonds from wealthy people. He sold bonds to wealthy people to accrue money so that he could subsidize key industries that he thought were vital to have us eventually become economically self-sufficient. He was for subsidizing transportation and communication from one region to another to get trade moving and get commercial contacts connected. He also was for putting import tariffs on competitive goods coming from Europe, from abroad, so that it would artificially inflate their price and have Americans buy the American-made products instead. So that's kind of a, an artificial assistance to the manufacturers here. So those are just a few of the main examples in which Hamilton had a, quote, system, right? And then if I didn't mention it also, he created a controversial national bank that was 2/5 private and 3/5 public or government. And so, yeah, at any rate, that's hardly laissez-faire, right? Government let it be, let the economy be. But when Jefferson took over in 1800 as president, the conservatives were scared to death that he was going to just topple that economic system, being more of a kind of libertarian liberal. And he didn't. He not only kept the system going, but he even worked with it. He was the president, ironically, that had the Cumberland Road, the first national road through multiple states, subsidized by the government to connect different regions. So my point being, if he was on the left, he sure as heck wasn't that far on the left. And then you have the right. Okay. And of course, the two people I think of on the right are Hamilton and our second president, John Adams. All right. Now, yes, they feared the masses having too much of a say in government because, like Aristotle and Plato, they shared those stereotypes that the average person doesn't have the virtue, the self-control, the wisdom, the intelligence regarding political science, etc., to rule very wisely and well. But that does not mean they did not want a popularly elected House of Representatives, like the English House of Commons. And they wanted it to have checks and balances with the upper house of senators who were chosen by the state legislators, which is one step away from democracy, right? People democratically elected their own state legislators, and then they chose, these elected reps, chose the senators, two for each state. So, yeah, they distrusted the masses, but they still wanted a lower elected house of the masses with its own powers and checks and balances. All right. They both were abolitionists. They're both against slavery. They're supposed to be like these uber conservatives. They both took a stand against slavery. John Adams demonstrated that when he recognized Haiti. Remember, Haiti had formerly known as the what was it? Saint Dominique. It had a revolution from the African Americans, led by that guy, that Toussaint Louverture. At any rate, they took over. They won, and virtually everywhere in the world, it was known as the first Black Republic in the Western Hemisphere. And John Adams recognized the new government and basically said, "Good for them, good for the slaves in rebelling." Right? So are they really that far to the right? And yes, Hamilton thought about trying to promote the president to serve for life. That is true. But everything else was still the same. He wanted him to be able to be impeached by Congress. He wanted him to be elected by the Electoral College vote, which we still use. And so anyway, my point being is they were not monarchs. They did not want an emperor. They wanted a popularly elected democratic body in Congress. They were abolitionists. And they, of course, were for the rule of law in the form of a written constitution that enumerated a Bill of Rights. So to me, right, that's not that far to the right. And also, especially with John Adams being a very religious Christian, they both were for separation of church and state, which was an Enlightenment concept. They didn't want an established governmental church. They thought it would just become corrupt and greedy. So, okay, you get these elections, right? 1796 and 1800, John Adams against Jefferson. John Adams' side said, "Don't vote for Jefferson. He'll start beheading the rich, wealthy landowners, and inaugurate a reign of terror, like over in France when the Jacobins took over the French Revolution. He'll destroy Hamilton's economic system. He'll decentralize everything, whether the Constitution says he can or not. And he's going to give power. He's going to give the supremacy of power to the common people, right? In the French Revolution, they called them sans-culottes, those without the fancy nylons. That was the word, that was the term they used in the French Revolution for like the proletariat, the hardworking manual laborers. It was their turn to rule. Because arguably in France and later in Russia, you had bona fide revolutions, but not here, not in the US. And then, so when he took over in 1800, did any of that happen? No. There was no land redistribution. There was no confiscation of property from the wealthy. They were not declared enemies of the state, like in France. Nothing was done with Hamilton's system, et cetera, et cetera. All right, he didn't decentralize the republic. And then before that, in 1796, John Adams won. And Jefferson's side said, don't vote for John Adams. He'll become a king. Right? And of course, when he ruled, he did kind of fly solo. He alienated his own party as well as the liberals. But he did nothing of the sort to try to lengthen his term as the president. Nothing to, even the most controversial things that he had passed, he had his fellow Federalists in Congress pass them by popular vote. He didn't give like executive decrees or anything like that. So he was far from a king. So to me, right, I think they knew this. I think both sides knew this. I think this is good old-fashioned hyperbole. Remember, hyperbole is strategic, manipulative exaggeration for some end, right? I think they both deliberately exaggerated how far to the left or how far to the right the other was. And so guess what? When the conservative won in 96, the liberals didn't rebel. When the liberal Jefferson won in 1800, the conservatives didn't rebel. Because I think they knew deep down, nothing really fundamental was going to change. Because again, on the ideological spectrum between left and right, I feel like they were like this. They were pretty darn close. I mean, after all, they came to consensus at the Constitutional Convention, right? With the Constitution and the type of republic that we'd have. Are you there? No idea what happened. All right. So at any rate, the point being, right, is that the ideological spectrum was pretty narrow in the US. So therefore, it was easier to reach consensus, and it was easier to recognize the electoral victory of your opponent because you knew the world was not going to end, right? But with the Latin Americans, right, it was different. Let's see here. Claims for self-determination, states historian John Charles Chastain, were only for people of European descent in the US. Conversely, wars for independence were fought by and revolutionary claims applied to a non-white majority in many Latin American nations. Big difference. So, for instance, that's supposed to be Day. Francisco de Miranda. Okay. Miguel Hidalgo. I would venture to say, and then also there was Father Morelos somewhere down here. But look at some of these things here. They were for. Miguel Hidalgo kept a library of French Enlightenment books. He dabbled with Fourier's notion of communal possession of property. Fourier was like an early like Marxist, right? With like a form of like communism or socialism. He declared a national end to slavery. Freed slaves would be equal to whites under the law. And he eventually espoused a democratic republic of men of all colors. So Father Miguel Hidalgo, right? He was way further to the left in demanding change than any of the left guys in the American Revolution, namely like Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson. And then here's where I say here is that and then Francisco de Miranda, he declared the Declaration and the Rights of Man from the French Revolution. He had traveled to France, like when it was in its like radical phase, and was for the radical changes that were going on. And he came back and he got arrested. Hidalgo ends up becoming executed because he used violence, right? September 16th that they celebrate the Mexican people. Father Miguel Hidalgo was a priest at Dolores. He had been having salons, these illegal intellectual meetings where they would read Enlightenment books that had been banned by the Catholic Church and the formal Inquisition board. And they had all kinds of accusations against him. They said he was so much of a free thinker that he doubted the virgin birth of Christ. He doubted the sinlessness of Mary. Just fundamental Catholic beliefs. Okay, this guy went against the grain. He had a big garden, and they said that he was already trying to prepare himself to have his village become self-sufficient and share in the cultivation of the food there with one another and share that land. Okay. So then I say, this type of boldness elicited an equal and opposite reaction in Latin American figures who stood for the Ancien regime, for the old order of things, constitutional monarchies, an aristocracy, a state-established church, ruled by men of Spanish blood only, right? Notice those things I just listed, the American conservatives were not that conservative, just as they weren't nearly as liberal as Father Hidalgo. So notice the ideological gap in Mexico and in Latin America was much bigger. All right. In Mexico, what happens, right, is Father Hidalgo gets killed, and then Father Morelos gets killed carrying the banner of Hidalgo. And then it lands to Guadalupe Victoria. I have his picture at the bottom. And Vicente Guerrero. Vicente Guerrero was he was biracial. They called it mulatto back then. We don't call that anymore. But they were for redistribution of property, local democratic rule, political equality of men of all ethnicity and pigmentation. Okay, so they had some pretty radical democratic enlightened beliefs. Because remember with the Enlightenment, right? It came in the 1740s and it made its way across the Atlantic by way of the intelligentsia. The intelligentsia were the few people who had learned literacy and oftentimes had the money and the leisure to buy these books, to read them, and to put them in a more simple language that the average person could understand and offer them to the people, offer those ideas to the people. So for instance, with the Enlightenment, right, you have the social contract by John Locke and Rousseau. The idea that the first government likely came while people were in a state of nature and did as they pleased. They surmised way back in history. as hunter-gathering people who were just on their own. Enough people started to, on account of the fallenness of man, enough people started to have their stuff stolen, to be extorted. Like, here, I'm going to beat you over the head with this club if you don't catch me some fish, etc. Enough of that happened, they surmised, that begrudgingly the people got together and said, let's give permission for a body of government to rule us, but that government is our servant and not our master. It's going to recognize our natural rights. And remember, a natural right is superior to a civic right, because a natural right you're entitled to by birth, by virtue of being made in God's image as a human being. You're entitled to that right. All right. So the three that they popularized, Locke and Rousseau, was life, liberty, and property. No one has the right to take your life. No one has the right to enslave you. And no one has the right to take away the fruits of your labor. Okay. And then other natural rights were added to it. So, for instance, you had a guy named, it's spelled like Diderot, 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 and another guy named Condorcet, Condorcet. They wrote the first encyclopedias. And they thought that it was a natural right for people to cultivate themselves to the very utmost, as much as their talents would take them and their efforts. So educate yourself, learn a trade, do your best at that trade and make as much money as you can, right? Kind of American dream type stuff. But it was bigger than that, right? It was the idea of just fully cultivating yourself morally and everything to become as perfect and cosmopolitan, like a citizen of the whole world, and complete as you can. And I can't prove it, but I believe that's what Jefferson meant when he said pursuit of happiness. I think he was thinking of Diderot and Condorcet and the right of self-cultivation. Right? You had a guy named Beccaria, Beccaria, and he wrote about your rights as a suspect. If you're suspected of having done this or done that, you should have certain basic human rights. So that is absolutely demonstrated in our Bill of Rights. And we collectively call it due process, that we're all entitled to. And then you had Voltaire, Voltaire. And Voltaire, right, he was an iconoclast. He shattered that which was sacred. He made fun of the Catholic Church and the priests and the monks. He made fun of the king and certain French traditions. And he said, basically, everyone ought to be free to express himself, even if it's in ways that offend other people. And included in that began the inclusion of the right to peacefully protest the government. So basically, he's kind of the father of our First Amendment, Voltaire. All right. And then the Scottish liberals, because they kind of had their own enlightenment. The main enlightenment I've been talking about so far is the French Enlightenment. The Scottish liberals, they were mainly libertarian, right? You cannot trust government. The bigger it is, the more distant it is, the more resources it has. Look out, the more dangerous it's going to be to your liberties. So to them, they wanted to keep government small, loose, localized, accountable. All right. And in doing so, like I said, that included the right to bear arms. Such was their distrust of government. They didn't want government to accumulate an arsenal powerful enough to turn on its own people. So the right to bear arms comes from the Scottish liberals. So the literati, Francisco de Miranda, Miguel Hidalgo, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, These guys knew French. They could read the books in the original French, and then they could translate it to Spanish, to English for their people, right? In more simple form. So the average means of informing the people was through pamphlets. And an average pamphlet was anywhere between 12 and 35 pages. So short enough that the average person could, even if not at one sitting, could read it and put in language and syntax in which the common person could read it. All right. And then some people believe that it was all propaganda, that this, literati, this intellectual elite, merchant elite, the lawyers, the big plantation owning planters, the bankers, and the businessmen, that they kind of formed a cabal, a unit of rule, and they were feeding this propaganda to the common people to get them to buy into the new government. And then there's some people who believe that, although riddled sometimes with some contradictions, that some of the literati genuinely believed it, were willing to give their lives for it, and genuinely wanted their people to live it out. And Father Hidalgo, like I said, you can go against his his challenges to his own Catholic faith, despite being a priest, with some of the fundamental beliefs, him illegally having these salons, etc., him having also some illegitimate children, and he was supposed to have sworn to celibacy as a priest. He definitely had his faults, but he seemed to be perfectly willing to first endanger and then ultimately sacrifice his own life for this cause of justice for the poor people. All right. And then what happens is Victoria and Guerrero and the liberals, they could not definitively win. They went back and forth for years. And then finally, Santa Anna switches sides. And he convinces Iturbide to switch sides as well. And what it was not ideological, from what I've read. It's not that the conservatives became liberal, okay, or won over by their vision of the country. But instead, right, for one, they were tired of fighting. And secondly, even the conservatives who were getting the help from the Spaniards were they had a schism with the Spaniards, and they were ready to kick the Spaniards out and have their own country. So they decided on a compromise. And they did the 3 guarantees. They said Spanish-blooded Criollos who were born in the Americas are legally equal under the law with the Peninsulares, with those who this generation have moved from Spain, right? They're entitled to the same positions of rule, everything. They said, secondly, we will keep the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, we'll keep the Roman Catholic Church as our state church, our governmental sanctioned church. And then thirdly, we'll have a constitutional monarchy. And the constitutional part, right, was supposed to be a compromise between the liberals and conservatives. Because a monarch, are you kidding me? Right? That was already seen as archaic, as old school. But that monarch is limited in what he or she can do by a written constitution now. So that was seen to be a compromise. So the first monarch was Iturbide. And Iturbide shut down the Diputación, the Congress. Like, wait a minute, Congress, those are the ones elected by the people. And you're just going to shut it down? You're going to rule as a one-man despot? So a rebellion arose, and he was overthrown. Okay. Then they had Guadalupe Victoria rule as a liberal, And he didn't do too much liberally. I think he was worried about keeping the two sides together. He served his full term, and then Anastasio Bustamante and Vicente Guerrero ran against each other, and there was quite a gap between those two. And supposedly they say Guerrero won, and Bustamante could not abide it, and he overthrew Guerrero. Guerrero went in hiding and then formed an army to try to foment a civil war. And before he could get enough troops, he was captured and executed by Bustamante. Then Bustamante went after the press, being an uber conservative, and shut down their rights of expression and peaceful protest, etc. So the people had enough of that, and Santa Anna overthrew him. And the list goes on and on. I have a part of it on the next assignment, where I give a chronology of one kind of a coup, right? C-O-U-P, a blow to the state through violence or the threat thereof. One coup or civil war after another. And such were the differences, you guys, that on multiple occasions, it did not just suffice to change who was ruling. They actually scrapped the old constitution and wrote a new one. So that's a major instability in Mexico. And of course, back then, right, and for the longest time, people just said, "Oh, that's in the Latino nature, right? They're passionate. They're so passionate that their impulses and feelings override their intellect." And that's called essentialism, when you stereotype an entire ethnicity or nationality. So that essentialist stuff, I don't buy into at all, needless to say. But I'm saying it was circumstantial. That their gap between their left and right was big. They had people who were really, truly liberal and people who were really, truly conservative. So hence, when one side takes over, right, it's so fundamentally different from the government that you would have established that you feel like it could be the end of your country. And you almost feel a need to rise up and get those people out. Okay. Then as far as U.S. interpretations is, we kind of did number 2 already. Court history is you have these French and Scottish Enlightenment ideas, and then you have the people who had time and read well and wrote well, etc., that as intellectual bridges, who read this stuff and put it in a format that the common person could understand. So hence, I call that court history, right? Because it's making America look exceptional, special, right? Any regular country is born on blood, ambition, desire for power, coveting, a position. But not here, right? According to Bernard Bailyn, this is America is a nation of ideals that spread from France and Scotland. Then the salutary neglect thesis of the U.S. is that we were virtually neglected by the British, our 13 colonies, and it had a healthy or salutary effect on us. Our elected assemblies gained more and more powers than were ever considered for them. And we smuggled and did what we wanted economically and avoided the Navigation Acts very successfully, and we got enriched, kind of technically illegally. So then at the end of the French and Indian War, the British tried to put us in our place in 1763. But we were already independent and powerful. So we said, "Sorry, Dad, too little, too late. You're not coming home now and running the roost. I'm already 18 and very successful." So that's called the healthy or salutary neglect thesis. And that's popular back in England, about having lost us as a colony. Then revisionist, I showed evidence of George Washington having, sour grapes him wanting to advance up the military command, and him wanting to do what he wanted to do with his own farm produce. And both were stopped by the British patronage system. Remember, patronage is that you have to have the proper entitlement and support from a high-ranking Brit to do something for a living or to gain a position. So to George Washington, right, that was unfair. He thought it should be earned. Okay. And then Howard Zinn, boy, what a cynical thesis. Is he just contends that the poor were ready to rebel in the American colonies. They were just waiting for a spark. And the elite, right? Because really, when you look at the Constitutional Convention, you guys, they were not a mini example of the colonies, which they would call a microcosm. They were not a microcosm of the colonies, right? In reality, like 1/10% of the population went to college. Okay. Maybe 2% were lawyers, if that. And the majority, right, of the men at that convention were college educated. Many of them were lawyers, very big merchants and businessmen, and planters, right, who owned slaves. So they were the elite, right? And so a lot of them, as the colonial elite, they'd already participated in government, in the British government, as assemblymen. That was the road that was open to them, right? Was to be elected in your colony as an assemblyman. But then there was an upper house and a governor you had to contend with. And the governor, in many cases, was handpicked by the crown. And then that governor handpicked his own royal council. And they could veto what you did. And so, they were limited in their power. But if they could get rid of the Brits, right, they'd get rid of the royal council, they'd get rid of the royal governor, they could be the top dogs with the British out of the equation. So Howard Zinn, thinking that they were thinking of their own enrichment, said they used the Enlightenment of France and of Scotland as propaganda to try to manipulate and enlist the enthusiasm of the commoners to fight with and for them against the British so they could become the top dogs left. All right. That's Howard Zinn's thesis. So anyway, are there any questions or comments? So look at this at Chilpancingo under Father Morelos when they met. Sovereignty. Remember, sovereignty is what is the source of authority. Someone has power over you, he only has it until you push him off of you, right? Authority is when you give up fighting and say, you know what, you are my authoritative figure. I surrender, I obey you. So authority is big, right? So sovereignty is the source of authority. Sovereignty should reside in the people, and male suffrage should be universal. Slavery in all caste systems should be abolished. Remember, caste as opposed to class, it implies much more permanence. Okay? When you use that term class, it's implied that it's fluid, that you could rise up to it and you could fall down from it. From good luck, bad luck, great hard work or laziness, brilliance or the lack thereof, right? But a caste system, it's like it's been ascribed to you. You're in this class and there's virtually no way of leaving it. So all caste systems should be abolished. Government monopolies should be abolished and replaced by a 5% income tax. All judicial torture should be abolished. So see, like I said, they were ahead of their time. Now, granted, they had a little bit of time to get more radical, than the founding fathers. They could see what the founding fathers had done in the 1770s and early 1780s, and they could try to see what they like and see what they don't like about what they had done, because most of the battles fought were between 1808 and the 1820s in Latin America. So it's a generation later. And by the way, I have it in here somewhere. If you may know, then that's great. The main event that sparked all this was, well, actually, the Enlightenment and the salons and the Spanish Inquisition going after the salons of these illegal books, that got a lot of attention and a lot of talk about freedom and democratic government and all that, and liberal changes for sure. But one of the main opportunities that came to the Latin American countries was the takeover of Spain by France. Because remember, Spain is their mother country. That's their colonist. That's their colonial leader. And Napoleon took over Spain. And by 1808, had put his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne of Spain. So clearly, right, the people in Spain itself didn't recognize Joseph Bonaparte. So why in the heck would the Latin Americans across 3,000 miles across the Atlantic, why would they recognize him? They didn't. So they followed the lead of Spain. What the different regions, because remember, Spain is made up of lots of regionalism, right? Of these different provinces: Navarre, Castile, Leon, Aragon, and so forth. They formed their own committees in the major towns and in the major regions, called juntas, right? Juntas. They formed these juntas, and because of the Enlightenment that had already gone on, right, the previous generation, some were influenced by that and said that we declare, in the absence of King Carlos IV of Spain, sovereignty resides, it comes back to the people here in this region. Okay. And that's a dangerous thing, right? Because when the king does come back, they've already espoused that sovereignty, authority, permission to rule abides by their permission, right? During the time of this absence. Napoleon asked for Carlos IV and his son Fernando VII to come and speak to him on terms, and he just kidnapped him. So at any rate, Napoleon releases Fernando VII, the boy who comes slightly of age, to return to the Spanish throne. Napoleon's got bigger fish to fry, obviously, by 1812. And so Fernando VII comes back, right? And he begins throwing his weight around. And then you start having rebellions in Spain against their returned king. And so then what happens is the Spaniards, the nobility and the bourgeoisie, team up in a rare occasion, and kind of like the Magna Carta, right, in 15 or 1215 in England, is they threatened to kill Fernando. They came to him and threatened him with violence and said, you are going to sign a liberal constitution that guarantees individual rights, local autonomy, participatory government, etc. So Fernando VII had no choice. He had to sign this. And that's what's ironic, is in Mexico, the conservatives were winning in the Civil War against the liberals. And when they saw this liberal constitution and saw that it would be applied to the colonies, they said, heck no. And that was one other big reason why the conservatives split from the Spanish forces and decided to cut a deal with the liberals and compromise on the three guarantees. All right. So that's that. And then quickly, because there's a lot of reiteration that I'm not going to do, obviously for your sake, so we were not here forever today. But I say the same things in a lot of this, the ideological gap and the U.S. being able to have, let's see here. Yeah, look, I did an overlap. Some of this information is the same. I apologize for that. Yeah, that's not good. I don't know if I'm going to change that or if it's too late by now, but you'll definitely see that. But here, starting with this paragraph here, okay, this is where it gets important. Here's where it gets different. Okay. So let's see here. The Treasury Department assumed national and state debts with a promise to pay back those who were owed money. Okay. They sold bonds to the wealthy, levying taxes and so forth. They encouraged European consumption of bonds and bank ties with constitutionally dubious national bank. Let's see here. Fletcher versus Peck in 1810, the Supreme Court did its part, which declared business contracts inviolable. Dartmouth versus Woodward, limiting state government's powers to interfere with businesses. And Givens versus Ogden declared Congress's power to nullify state business monopolies. The Federalists created the legal framework that established a healthy business environment for entrepreneurs and the legal possibility to forge a unified modern national economy out of the fragmented state governments that jealously feuded over resources and markets. And the Chief Justice behind that, these are no coincidences that just fell into place. His name was John Marshall, and he was a hardcore conservative who was like pro Alexander Hamilton in his system, needless to say. So they placed import tariff on competing goods, right? They recognized public corporations and made the process to form one relatively attainable and ability to profit from inventions worthwhile. They promoted industrialization. They devised a bank to help subsidize entrepreneurs whose business endeavors benefited the nation. The Federalist encouragement of trade, they subsidize or help pay for public works. So turnpike roads, canals, railroads, communication like the telegraph wires, to connect the merchants, the husbandmen are farmers, artisans, mechanics, and manufacturers of one region to another, resources to factories, factories to markets. All right. So then it's no coincidence, they say, with Hamilton's system set up, how we took off. So look at this. The national government spent 60 million on roads and canals alone. The state's spending almost 10 times as much as that. So they were willing to foot the bill, right, to connect different regions. Steamboats plied upwardly against the Mississippi River's current now. The Erie Canal connected the Great Lakes region with the Atlantic coast. That was huge, you guys. Getting Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Minnesota, Wisconsin, all that area up there connected to New York and the East Coast. That canal was huge, hugely important for commerce, for trade. From 1784 to 1824, the U.S. population tripled. The number of cities of 5,000 grew from 12 to nearly 150 from 1820 to 1850. And skilled work changed from individual fashioning and in-home production to assembly line production using interchangeable parts, right, that were first used by Eli Whitney with a gun, by way of water or steam power, and machine by the 1840s. This growth was partially sustained by capital, right, money with which you invest, aided by foreign capital, and ties to the amount of $500 million before the Civil War. So $500 million was spent on investments from foreigners in Europe, just wanting to invest in this business or that. And of course, that gives capital to the business, money to play with. to buy machinery, etc. By the time of such war, interregional and global trade, access to ample capital, a population increase, urbanization, and improvements in transportation, communication, and use of water and steam power, mechanization, and liberal inducements to innovation created a major manufacturing sector that diminished America's economic dependence upon foreign nations for their goods. So what am I saying here, right? I'm saying that it was by design and we became an economic monster. Sadly, right, as you probably know, one of the succeeding coming up topics is going to be the Mexican-American War and how we bullied land from Mexico. I'm trying to show here part of the reason how we were able to do it, how we had the means, the strength to do it. We're becoming a giant. Okay. So then we bought land tracts from the Choctaw and all these other tribes in Tennessee, Kentucky, the Ohio Valley, right? So then as we were buying that land from the natives, there became a large population movement into those Western lands. And needless to say, you guys, violent confrontations were so common with the Native Americans that they had just freshly bought from. Because remember, with our treaties, you guys, we have a horrible history of almost extortion when we make treaties with Native American tribes. You are going to do this or else, and we threaten them with multiple threats. So a lot of them, right, who weren't the chiefs who signed it, because they had like expressions in their own languages. Don't sign the white man's pen. Don't grab the white man's pen. And so at any rate, a lot of them stuck around saying, I didn't agree to sell this land. And such was the fighting in Tennessee alone that the natives called a lot of the Scots-Irish that were moving in there long knives, because of their Bowie knives and their willingness to use them. Then I show the political instability of Mexico. In Mexico's first 33 years, 49 administrations came and went. Think about that. That averages more than one a year. 33 years, 49 administrations. Okay. So, yeah, let's see here. Vicente Guerrero was then overthrown. Anastasio Bustamante, then he was overthrown. Then Gomez Farias, and he was overthrown. I'd like to get into Gomez Farias, but I'm going to wait one more class because he's part of the narrative of the American takeover of the West. Yeah. So you had the liberal Constitution of 1824. You had the Siete Leyes, the 7 laws. You had the Bases Orgánicas, organic bases Constitution. And the list goes on of scrapped constitutions and new ones. This created widespread uncertainty about the rules of business. Needless to say, guys, when you have a country with that much unrest, that does not attract businessmen to want to invest. Okay? So while they're fighting it out, they're not growing like the U.S. is. They're not burgeoning into an economic giant like we are. Okay? And I don't know how relevant that last part I put in there is. The average Mexican woman in the early 1800s, states Wasserman, was either a stay-at-home mother who might supplement family income in a skilled trade from home, trade just sold in a local market, or an urban criada or maid. The young unmarried Mexican adolescents working in obrajes or factories and textiles or tobacco were poorly paid and few in number. As for the average Mexican man at this time, Wasserman asserts that he did not own his own land, but often rented space from and labored for an hacendado, a plantation owner. Consequently, not only was the Mexican nation vulnerable to foreign threats amidst such instability, its people had enough to worry about just meeting their family's basic material needs. So there on the left is Guadalupe Victoria, the first elected president, and one of them that actually served his full 4-year term and was for the liberal Constitution of 1824. And then to the right is the much more controversial Santa Anna that we'll get more into when we get into the American takeover of the West. Okay? Do you guys have any questions? All right. Well, I believe I have, give me just a second. I don't have quite all of your names. I may, let's see. Okay, let's see here. Xavier, I always forget to put yours down. You always kind of sneak up on me at the end. All right, so. All right, well, you guys hang in there. And that's all I have for today. Okay, I hope that helps. Good luck with your work. Stick with it, okay? Because we got to be close to midway. All right. Xavier, thank you. Have a good one. Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, Gabriella. Xavier, take care.